Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn. Dunn is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small. And we train engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building. And if you want to create change in your community, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need support with a legal issue, it can feel daunting. And that's why for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping guide clients with their legal needs. They're here to help you when you need them the most, from workplace to medical injuries, class actions, occupational diseases, and wills and estates planning. As Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the local knowledge and the national network with the experience that you can count on. To find out more, just go to their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that change minds, emails that drive donations, and events that will energise the community both online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners, and to find out more, you can go to their website, which is swiftfoxcrm.com, to win your next campaign. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that drops out every Friday, that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on today's show, we are going to be unpacking the Yes referendum that happened on the weekend. Unfortunately for all of us that were supporting the Yes campaign, it didn't get up. Just another referendum that has been put to the people of Australia, and they've said no. We're now like 8 for 45 or something. So today we're going to be talking to three people that I've had on the show previously to talk about the Voice campaign. We're going to be talking to Marcus Stewart, who was the former co-chair for the First People's Assembly of Victoria. The First People's Assembly of Victoria, if you don't know what that is actually the Voice that is in Victoria. It's been legislated here in Victoria. And the Voice... the First People's Assembly are in the process of negotiating a treaty with the Victorian State Government. Marcus was a co-chair in the first Assembly. They've now elected a new Assembly. So that journey towards truth treaty and Voice continues here in Victoria, regardless of what happened over the weekend. So Marcus will be on the show. We'll also be joined by Professor Andrea Carson from the Latrobe University, who is from the Department of Political Communication. We've had Andrea on the show previously as well, and we'll be hearing from John Armitage, who is from Kudos Research. John obviously is a qual and quant researcher who's done heaps of work on the progressive side of politics for a number of years. John's going to be on the show today. So the four of us are going to unpack the campaign, also recognising that a lot of people in the First Nations community will be hurting right now. But this is also a campaigns podcast, and we have a responsibility to, whether we win or lose, and you know that you've listened to this podcast before, we've had a lot of successful results from the social democratic side in the last couple of years, and we've loved doing our post-election analysis because we've normally won. Unfortunately, this time we didn't, and we want to adhere to those norms of always doing an election result analysis, whether we get up or not. Unfortunately, this time we didn't, but we're going to do it with respect, but also adhering to the norms as a community organiser in evaluation. That is looking at what were the successes of a campaign, but also what were the lessons. And that's how we're going to try and tackle today's podcast and today's topic. And we hope from that, we can take some of those lessons and work out where do we go from here and find the hope in the challenges that came out of the weekend. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the show, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast when you're done listening, and leave us a review. And for all the updates, follow Dunn on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All right, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Monday lunchtime on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And today's episode is an episode that we're doing with heavy hearts as a progressive podcast. But we're doing it anyway because we're also a campaign podcast. And whether we win, lose, or draw, not that there's ever too many draws in political campaigns, it's still important to do. And I'm joined by three people that I've had on the show previously to talk about all sorts of different campaigns. And I'm glad that they've taken the time out of their afternoon to come on the show and dissect what happened over the weekend. And first of all, I want to introduce Marcus Stewart, who's the former co-chair of the First People's Assembly of Victoria and probably now in dire need of a break because he has been everywhere over the last 6 months. Marcus Stewart, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Professor Andrea Carson from the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy at, as I always say, my alma mater, graduated, class of 1996/2009. That's me, not you, Andrea. Andrea Carson, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thanks, Stephen.
And finally, John Armitage, researcher from the Kudos Research Consultancy. John, welcome back to Socially Democratic as well.
Great to be here.
Okay.
Well, sort of miserable and great at once.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just give folks a bit of a snapshot of where we are in terms of the results first, and then I want to go to Marcus, to you first. But just an overview: the national vote as we record, which is like at 12:14 in the afternoon on Monday, the 16th of October, 39.4% yes, 60.6% no. And in terms of the state breakdowns at this moment, the highest yes state was Victoria at 45%, followed by Tasmania at 40.5%, then New South Wales at 40.4%, and then Western Australia at 36.4%, South Australia at 35.4%, and then finally Queensland at 31.2%. So they're the results. We'll do more unpacking of those numbers in a moment. But before we start to move into that, I actually want to go to you, Marcus, to begin with, as both an Aboriginal Victorian, but also a leader within your community. How are you feeling this morning?
I mean, I think like many of our community, feeling pretty numb, but also this one stings, and it stings a lot, and it cuts pretty deep. So, but I think it's important for our community. Look, we are the oldest continuous culture on the planet, and we are the most resilient people on this earth. We are still here. We'll still be here. So for our community, they need to know that this hurts, we'll need to heal, but we'll get through this. This hasn't been a referendum on who we are as a people. It's been a referendum on 92 words that Australians didn't get their head around. They didn't know what it meant, and they probably felt it wouldn't have made a difference. So that's where we sit here today. And, it's really hard for our community, and, for them, they need to know that they're loved, they're respected, and, the country did turn out. The numbers that you've just read out, there's still a big proportion of people who voted yes. Obviously more voted no, but, there is a lot of solidarity with our community out there, and we can't forget that.
I read some reports yesterday in The Guardian that some within the Aboriginal community were calling for a week of silence. And so when I read that, I thought to myself, oh, do we do this podcast? And when I reached out to you, Marcus, saying, do you want to come on the show? You said yes. I just want to get your thoughts on this week of silence, because we don't want to be disrespectful to how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are feeling at this very moment.
Yeah, I completely respect the position that a lot of leaders have taken with the week of silence, and it's not the approach I've taken. I've got a responsibility as playing a role in this campaign to speak to our community here in Victoria, our mob, to understand what has happened, and as does the First People's Assembly of Victoria, and we've stepped into that responsibility, and We're currently, having conversations about what we see has happened, what this means for our community, but importantly, that we will get through this. We're a resilient people. We are a resilient culture. And basically, the issues on the day before referendum day that our community were facing were still the issues they were facing on referendum day. And it was still the issues faced on the Sunday, yet being yesterday. The issues haven't gone away. So we've got a responsibility to roll our sleeves up and get to work. And we need to get around the table and start looking at those solutions.
And we'll certainly address some of those towards the end of today's show. I want to bring Andrea Carson to this conversation. Andrea, what do you think that this result says about our nation from a non-Aboriginal perspective? How have you reflected on the result from Saturday night?
I like the frame of words that Marcus used, actually, that Australians didn't get their head around it. I don't know if I'd go a lot further than that. I mean, I did a report today looking at some of the international coverage of the referendum, and international media has been fairly unflattering and can look at this maybe with a plainer lens than what we do ourselves, and, has used language such as it's been based on lies and racism. But I also think that in order to get change with a referendum, you need to bring the people with you over a long duration of time. And I don't think that happened in this case with the Yes campaigns. I think there was too little too late. But keep in mind, if we go back to October last year, support for the referendum was up around 64%. So I don't think we can judge Australians on just one snapshot in time. We have seen movement. The problem was, of course, between that date and the referendum on Saturday, was that it lost bipartisan support, and a lot of Australians take their cues, whether we like it or not, from political elites. And when you've got conservative politicians, including some Indigenous elected politicians, telling you to vote no, that resonates with some people. It's a heuristic, a shortcut for their thinking when they don't give attention or have the time, because everyone has busy lives, to really get into thinking critically about what the issue is for themselves. So we know that people do take these political shortcuts, and I think that's what we've seen here. But I'm sure John can speak further to that about the elements of partisanship in this. It's not perfect, but it's some of it.
John, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think that it is impossible to look at the results and not note the role of party affiliation. If you put seats into the category of so from notionally the most left being the Green seats, then you go to the Safe Labor and fairly Safe Labor and Marginal, and so on through to fairly to Safe Coalition. The yes/no vote is exactly in correlation. It's a perfect line, except I should say the teal seats, which is an interesting separate point. So I think you might reasonably say that if a major political party comes out, no, a lot of people don't engage that much in most issues, and fair enough, other things in their life. If the major party or parties that you generally take your sort of values cues from say vote no, another one says vote yes, I reckon give or take each side probably starts with about 30%. These are sort of back of the envelope numbers. I suspect that status quo adds something to the no pile there. If you said it only added about 10, that is just 1 in 10 people go, oh, I'm not sure, but when in doubt, don't change something as fundamental as the Constitution. But our task then is to, or anyone's yes task, is to then to try and get sort of out of the 30 to the left, you've got to get 21. And so that gets hard. However, if you look at the result at 39 or 37 or whatever, we didn't even get half of those that were up for grabs. Now, you could make another assessment and say that, in fact, more people are status quo. You don't have to go much higher than 10 before it starts to get physically impossible to ever win a referendum that's contested between the parties. That's possible. I accept that possibility. But if you say that there were contested votes up there, you would have to say we got pretty badly spanked in terms of the proportion that yes won versus no. And I think there are some structural and strategic and tactical reasons for that.
Marcus, I want to go back to you for 1 second because there was conjecture in the lead up to this referendum about what was the view amongst Indigenous folks across the country. And there was, one side was saying that no, most of mob don't actually agree with this referendum and are going to vote no. And obviously our side was saying, well, that's not the case at all. We've now had an election. We've now had a vote. Can we finally settle this question about whether or not Indigenous people were supporting this proposition to alter the Constitution?
Well, I think the booth data would portray the facts as that majority of our community did. So, I mean, the facts are the facts. You can't go saying that there's dodgy votes and all that happening, which we've seen in the media, which is unfortunate, and it's anti-democratic. We're lucky that we live in a society free of intimidation, coercion. When we vote, we can freely vote, free of violence. So it's disappointing to see some of that commentary. We can't go throwing the baby out with the bathwater when a narrative doesn't suit us, a retrofitted narrative that we've made up, or we've been fed from an imaginary friend. We have to own the facts in this, and the facts are that majority of our mob supported it. And unfortunately, it lost because majority of non-Indigenous people didn't, and that's where we find ourselves today.
Just unpacking some of these numbers, Andrea, Carson, just John mentioned before about the teals. I want to get a sense what you saw from what we saw in those what have now become teal seats since the last federal election. That was what's your reflections on that, and just get a sense more broader than that about what you thought about the vote and where, just to what John was talking about, how the votes transpired by party lines.
Yeah, so some of the teal seats had overwhelming support for yes. And in some ways, this wasn't all that surprising to me. And I look at the theory of post-materialism to understand it. For those not familiar with it, it's the idea that we move beyond material values when we determine how we're going to vote. And we look at things like self-satisfaction, altruism, tolerance, solidarity, things that are less tangible than material values, which are security, order, authority, work, professionalism, responsibility. And I know that Ian McAllister at ANU has done some work on this and found that by and large, Australia, unlike Europe, at least pre-Ukraine war Europe, we are still very much a materialist society and this half explains why action on climate change has been so hard to get off the ground in this country, because we get very bogged down in these sort of economic-based issues. But what we see, to get back to the question and the point at hand, with the teal seats, is many of the voters there have a post-materialist view of the world, as do millennials. And we know that the youth vote was up in this, and those teal seats were. Part of that is a luxury that comes with affluence as well, that when you're not worried about hip pocket issues, you can think about the world through a different lens than just day-to-day survival. And many of those teal seats are the more affluent seats that we have. And I guess some of them, and I throw myself in this category, sadly, that pejorative term of doctors' wives, where they can think about the world, through a fairly privileged lens. But the kicker to all this, I think, is Dutton's got himself a very long-term problem here, because he's hollowed out the moderate vote for the Liberals, and the teal vote's been emboldened. And we've seen that with the way that the numbers have landed here. I would think most of the candidates in those seats and Climate 200 would be feeling very pleased by this result, because the electorate is supporting those candidates' viewpoints. As you remember from the election, it was on three main policy areas of equality, gender equality, climate change action, and also on integrity in government. And it's going to be very hard for the Liberals, one would think, to find candidates to pre-select in there that can be competitive. And the moderates that exist in the Liberal Party, those that haven't already left, many of those were the Liberal for Yes vote. So I'll leave it to John to elaborate on this. I'm sure he's got more solid views about where that leaves the Liberal Party down the track, about which voters it will be appealing to.
Yeah, my question to you, John, is does this hurt the Liberal Party or the Labor Party more?
Well, that's a really good question. Just to give you a bit of the numbers on that, if you categorise seats according to who holds them, only the Green seats voted higher yes than the Teal seats. The Teal seats were at 57. That's 18. I've got 18 on mine. It might be actually even bigger than that by now. But anyway, to that order, 20-odd% higher than the national vote in the Teal seats, right? Now, before 2022, every one of those seats, I think, it would have either been in fairly safe or safe Liberal land, right? We would have considered that the safe Liberal seats, 26% yes. Coalition, fairly safe coalition, 32, 57 for Teal. So this is, Dunn's been doing a bit of talk about the idea of being the party of the outer suburbs. I reckon, as much as I've been thinking, geez, how are the Libs ever going to get these Teals back? What's their pathway to winning government without them? They're on that mission right now. I think they've assumed they're never getting them back. And they now have to somehow get a much bigger proportion of outer metropolitan. And again, if you do a geographic look at this vote, I won't put too many numbers into people's heads, but best inner metropolitan, one inner metropolitan seats, outer metropolitan, pretty much bang on the national average. Provincial, which is like regional centres, down, and rural, the lowest of all. So, is this worse for Labor or Liberal? I think that really depends on whether you think we're going to have a normal Labor-Liberal contest, in which case the Libs got spanked by this. If you think the New World Order is going to be some sort of unholy coalition of Liberal National One Nation, sort of dumbing of politics down and getting it angrier and dumber like the States and drawing more and more country and outer suburban people and just basically, from the Libs' point of view, riding off the inner city, well, that's a different contest. And at the moment, we're going to kill them in that contest. But I don't know if that's going to be the case eternally. I think we need to be ready for a very different battleground in the future.
I have a theory that I want to put to you all, and it's my Scottish Labour Party theory. In 2014, there was an independence referendum in Scotland asking the people of Scotland whether or not they wanted to leave the United Kingdom or not. In that campaign, maybe 6 months out from the vote, the Better Together campaign, so the campaign to remain with the United Kingdom, was struggling. And so the Labor Party had to then intervene into that campaign and throw all of its resources to ensure that the vote remained, that the no vote got up, basically. That really, really damaged the Scottish Labour Party in the eyes of traditional Scottish Labour voters, and they all walked away from the Labour Party. And in particular, in the west of Scotland, amongst what I would call the Irish Catholic diaspora, my family, all switched from being rusted on Labour voters to voting for the SNP at elections going forward, because they were disappointed in the Labour Party, because they always thought that they never thought the Labour Party was a unionist party, even though they are, but they didn't see them as that. Those values that they had as to why they were Labour, they thought that they would do the right thing and either stay out of the debate or maybe support this move towards independence. So there was this values proposition, this lack of alignment that happened, and it has kept the Labour Party out of office in Scotland, and it's hurt them in the Westminster seats. I mean, they got reduced down to one seat, a seat in Edinburgh, after the 2014 independence referendum. My theory is that this is going to be the same issue for the Liberal Party in Victoria. Is it that moderate, socially progressive Liberal voter, the traditional small L Liberal voter, is going to walk away from the Liberal Party in spades? And it's not just in the Teal seats, it's going to be everywhere. If we look at it, say, just from the Victorian context, but I think this is going to happen in Sydney, in Brisbane, in Adelaide, and probably Perth as well, that voter is going to walk away from the Liberal Party. And they're everywhere. It's not just in those seats. So those outer suburban seats of Melbourne, even though like a seat like Menzies, their vote is going to collapse there. There's going to be a bunch of Nazis that are going to go and vote for the Liberal Party. Racists are going to vote for the Liberal Party, but they're probably always there. But those socially progressive folks, they are going to look elsewhere, and there's no reason why the Labor Party can't get them. And there is a realignment that can take place there. If I was a Labor Party member and I'm in Menzies right now, or in seats that are like, say, Matthew Guy's seat in the state election, I would nominate at the next election, because I reckon you've got a good chance of winning. because I think that's what we're going to see. This is going to hurt the Liberal Party more than it's going to hurt the Labor Party. John Pizzuto, the leader of the Liberal Party in Victoria, voted no and campaigned for no in this campaign. His electorate voted 60% yes. I would run in Hawthorn again. John Kennedy, come back out of retirement, run again. You're probably going to get re-elected again, mate. That is my theory. Who wants to jump on that and pull that apart?
Yeah, I completely agree, Steve. And I suppose what I was thinking is, from our point of view, we got to look after our working class outer suburban and provincial seats here, because we don't want to lose those people. But the other side of the coin is, from a lefty perspective, we should absolutely be predating on those votes, really what I would describe as a sort of a upper middle class sort of white people educated seats that I think I probably do have a bit of a beef with them on that they think they worked hard to inherit their wealth, and I think they lucked out to inherit their wealth. But they believed in science, they got vaccinated, they believe in climate science, they are not racist, they are not bigoted, they are very strong supporters of things like marriage equality and trans rights. And there's 7 Teal seats. There were 3 seats the Greens got in Brisbane that I reckon a good Teal candidate might have got. There is Higgins that Labor got that I don't know that the Teal ran. It's not just those 7. The Liberal Party wins, the Liberal National Coalition, 60 of its 80 seats are metropolitan seats, right? And probably half of them are probably these sort of classic upper middle class educated white people seats. And they're so, yeah, if their strategy is to go after safe Labor seats and outer suburban seats, they better be very effective, because if we're half as effective on their turf, this may be a very dramatic mistake from them.
So the other thing to throw into the mix there is that we have compulsory voting, as you all know, and going off too far into the fringes is hazardous when the majority of voters through the mechanism of compulsory voting tend to gravitate around the centre a little bit off to one side or the other. So hollering out your moderate Liberal supporters, I can't see how that's a good idea for Dutton.
Speaking of the fringes,
There's
Marcus.
Also, one other thing.
Yeah, go, Marcus.
I just want to mention one thing, just really short. And it's an error that politicians have historically made and underestimated with Aboriginal leadership. And I think it's something that Labor politicians across Victoria should consider, is that Aboriginal leadership are going through the booth data very closely. And we are looking at who worked hard for this and who didn't, who thought that they would just cruise on in at the last minute and pretend that they were campaigning. But the data is very, very clear on who has worked hard so far. You look at Michelle and Higgins, 60% yes, ran a cracker campaign. So Aboriginal leaders are going through that very closely to see who was rhetoric and who was reality. And we'll put those politicians on notice.
At the federal level too, Marcus, because I reckon there's some absent voices, conspicuously absent voices at the federal level.
We're going through the federal booths.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energise the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. Can we talk about, I want to start to unpack a bit of the actual campaigns now, because this is a campaign podcast. But before we do, and the order I want to do it is in terms of sort of overall strategy and structure of the campaigns, and then move into messaging. But before we do, I just, to reiterate something, and I'm keen for some histrionics from the academic in the room here. Seeking change at a referendum is difficult. And it's deliberately so, because our founding fathers made it the case that they wrote this constitution, and if anyone was going to change it, they made it particularly difficult for those changes to happen. So in order to win the case for changing the constitution, I think your campaign has to nearly almost be perfect, particularly when it's a non-bipartisan contest, right? That is, if you've got one political party running against the other. So your campaign for the Yes team has got to be almost perfect. And I say that as a campaigner. Andrea, just before we jump into sort of debriefing this particular campaign, like just talk to us about how difficult it is to get change at a to amend the Constitution and some of the history that we've seen. I mean, what are the numbers, like 8 out of 46 now or something?
45 now, yeah. I mean, the numbers speak to it, don't they? And since Federation, no referendum has got up that hasn't had bipartisan support. And the other thing to keep in mind here is that the no case or the status quo case is always easier because you only need 3 states. It's got the double majority, of course. You've got to get all of the majority of Australians and the majority of states. And sadly, the territories don't feature in this. So getting the majority of states requires 4 if you want to engender change. So the status quo is always easier. And you also, in order to get the majority, you're pretty much going to have to get the East Coast states because that's where most of the population is. And that can be difficult when you've got different politics going on, say, at the top of Australia compared to the bottom, Queensland versus Victoria or New South Wales. So there's some big challenges there structurally before we even get into whatever issue it is that we're talking about. The other element to this is that fear and negativity track pretty well in campaigns. They can move the dial a couple of percentage points. When you're doing a referendum, you're wanting an affirmative campaign. You're trying to move from a no position to a yes position. And one might think that requires to be quite upbeat. And if we're starting to get into the messaging here, I'm not sure we saw enough of that positivity. We saw a lot of negative reasons for why people should affect change. And if people are weighing that up, the status quo bias is pretty strong and is also for those that, and as we know, not everyone's politically engaged. When we get to electoral politics, it's probably only about 30 or 40% that are really politically engaged and the rest turn on because of compulsory voting towards the end of a campaign. There's no reason to think a referendum's much different from that. So you've got to give people really solid reasons to lock on to affecting change. So these are all some of the difficulties, and I agree with you that you've got to have a very effective, near-perfect campaign if you're going to move off that status quo bias.
I want to talk about the strategy and the structure of the 2 campaigns. And if I can start with the Yes campaign first, and to you, Marcus, because I think you've probably got the closest eye on what that looked like. What were the strengths and the weaknesses that you saw with the Yes campaign in terms of both their strategy? And let's go way, way back to when they first started, but also then the structure, because it appeared to be there were 2 campaigns running, and I'm just wondering about did that hinder our ability to be an effective campaign outfit?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's probably too early for me to actually figure out in my own mind, what helped, what hindered structurally, strategy. I think one of the biggest challenges, I mean, you've hit the point, Andrew's hit the point, that referenda is a really high benchmark. It's very difficult to to reach that benchmark. You need a perfect campaign, as you've said. We didn't have the perfect campaign. Not only do you need the perfect campaign, you need flawless messaging when you do not have bipartisan support and you're up against mis and disinformation. We did not have flawless messaging. They're the facts. I mean, people are going to dissect that. They're going to analyse it. But if we had really cut through on our messaging, we would have reached Australian people, but we could not move the dial on what this meant. So that tells us our message was not cutting through as it was anticipated to do. So ultimately, the No campaign had one singular message to sell and basically put all their cards behind Warren and Jacinta and went, turned the dial up to 100 and they got ultimate cut through. They were very methodical in the audience they wanted to reach, when they wanted to reach them, and when they, and I guess how they felt that influence would happen. It kind of reminded me, and I'm not saying that this is it, but it reminded me of the wash-up out of Cambridge Analytica. Like the methodical nature of how they reached and the damage that they even done in Victoria demonstrates that they were almost flawless in their approach. We can, and reflections of, you know, my role in it and that, we kept getting stuck in the same sandpit and arguing, like the no would set the terms of the debate and we get sucked straight into it. We could never get out and set the context, because the challenge for us, we're having a conversation around nation building, the case for change, not the status quo. Our job wasn't to scare off 51% of the population and then, you know, put the queue in the rack. Our job was to be able to reach every Australian to try and persuade them and understand what this was. That didn't happen. Clearly, it didn't happen. So I think, you know, retro, whether it was structurally flawed, I don't know. People with better expertise will call on that as far as, you know, the campaign structures and whatnot. I think at the end of, on reflection, you know, 2 days on, I think the message really hurt us. I think we had too many messages in hindsight. We probably done, my earlier reflection is we probably done somewhat of the job of the no campaign and we further confused people. Now that's a harsh assessment, but you look at the raw numbers, 39% voted yes, or just under 40. You know, if we're not being able to explain what this is, that's just creating further confusion. And it kind of paralyzes people. So I think the nature of what's occurred, and as hard as that is for all of us to sit and cop, because we've put so much of ourselves into this, we've elevated what we understood. Over 60% of Australians didn't know there were issues in Aboriginal communities. Many didn't even know there were Aboriginal people outside of the Northern Territory. That's elevated now. Everyone's aware and acutely aware of the issues in Aboriginal communities. Now's the time to act for change. But firstly, it starts with us brushing ourselves off. We haven't won this. We've got to own that outcome. And we've got to basically define what the next steps are and the way forward. Our mob, as I said, our mob that was suffering the day before the referendum was still suffering on the day of and the day after and still today. They're still sitting in basically horrific circumstances, whether it's, you know, their life expectancy, clean drinking water, more like the kids more likely to go to prison than they are to go to university. That doesn't change. So we're going to roll our sleeves up and get to work. Like work started yesterday.
Marcus, there's a lot to unpack from what you just went through there. And I know we will talk about messaging in a moment, but I just want to bring John in first to talk a bit about maybe strategy and structure of the two campaigns. What were your observations from either the yes or the no?
Perhaps to give a little hint of what I'm going to say, I would like to preface my comments by saying that I think that everyone who worked for yes, good people doing good work, motivated by good things, and I don't offer a word of criticism to them that I won't take on board for myself. I had direct and indirect opportunities to participate in the way that this campaign was run, and we as a collective team, from which I pointedly exclude First Nations people who I think campaigned fabulously, won the hearts and minds of their community, and conducted themselves with extraordinary dignity, as you have done today, Marcus. So excluding our Aboriginal campaigners, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander campaigners, we were pretty rubbish, right? And I just want to be a bit fair about that in the sense that when you run a party campaign and someone goes off the reservation, the state secretary rings them up and says, pull your head in. If they don't listen to that, the parliamentary leader rings them up and says, pull your head in. If they don't listen to that, the leader of the faction rings them up and explains about the future of their career and in the party, and they pulled their head in. So there's also a predetermined organisational leader and political leader. So we've already settled on the voices, and we might not like the message or whatever that gets settled on, but we all know what it is, and we get our marching orders. So in fairness, there are a lot of things that are really hard, cat herding sort of stuff to bring together a big coalition. So I completely acknowledge all of that, completely acknowledge that these referendums are really difficult. But let me just take a step back. What's a few basic things you just got to get right for any campaign? You've got to have a clear values proposition. The first thing you're sitting down and thinking about is, what's our values proposition? Yes, in this case, is a self-determination idea. It's actually a very small step towards, it's a very, very, very humble step towards self-determination. Please listen to us before making decisions about us, not even may we choose for ourselves. So that had to be the anchor somewhere. That was the core values proposition that everything had to flow from. That was not where all messages were flowing from. Secondly, when you offer, all campaigns, change campaigns are offering a solution to a problem. So in the end, you've got to get down to a really simple understanding of the problem and a simple understanding of the solution, almost to the point where mentioning one begets the other. We're going to put 2 more lanes on the Western Freeway. I don't even need to mention the problem. It must be congestion, right? So you want to get them so close they go without saying. We had a fixed solution. So yes, started out with a fixed solution. No choice about defining that. Most campaigns, you get to define your solution a bit. I'm not worried about that. That just meant all the effort had to go in defining the problem. I didn't see any effort to define the problem. So where did the problem end up being was what, and I hate this term, and I want to come back to this later if we've got a minute, Aboriginal disadvantage. So on the one side of the ledger, you've got this great big pile of Aboriginal disadvantage, and the solution to that is a voice to Parliament. Now, there is a really simple logical connection of that. If you listen to people, you will get a better understanding of what's going on. With their advice, you will make better policies, and with better policies, you will be able to deliver better outcomes. That's simple, 3 steps. How many too many is that? 2. 1 step, orb 0, automatically makes sense to each other. So that didn't happen. There's no what I would call problem solution proximity. That was a mistake. It was certainly my mistake too. I didn't think of that until 6 weeks ago. Another thing you've got to get to is a single-minded proposition. So any person, by the end of the campaign, if you're on the booth and this is the first thing you've decided to participate in, and you've only half-assed watched TV a bit here or there, you know the singular proposition. Say no to division, and a precursor to that, if you don't know, vote no. Everyone knew that. I don't know what our closing message was, or in any way how it encapsulated a proposition based on our values to deliver our a solution to the problem. Another fundamental thing you just can't afford to ever get wrong on anything is do not get captured by your opponents. I mean, I saw an ad that actually summed up nearly everything I've said here. It's actually the only one I saw walking in my community, and it was this ad that a referendum campaign should be upbeat. This is not the actual problem I have. There's another one that I wasn't going to bother to mention, but it's got this sad, dour-looking Aboriginal faces, deliberately grainy in black or white. If one of those black fellas in that ad was my opponent, that is the photo I would pick to print off them to say, and then I dump a bucket of crap on them in my negative advertising. Negative ad, looks sad, miserable, deliberately black and white, no colour. And then it described this litany of problems, what the most obscure of which in a way was, I think, double rates of miscarriage. And then the closing message was basically say no to no. If you vote no, we'll get no progress. I mean, it's basically a say no to no. There's another way of saying say no to no, and that's yes, right? Like we had that some time ago. So we got so caught up in rejecting what was a mountain of lies and misinformation that we started talking about the lies and misinformation. We actually specifically went to this. What's my primary message? What they're saying ain't true. It's a guaranteed way to make what they're saying get high. They're literally guaranteed. You can do endless studies about this. If you say something ain't true, then the momentum and belief in that thing grows because it's now that's what we're debating. So that is not my full list, and I've not gone through it chapter and verse. But there are 4 things: failure to define a value proposition, failure to create problem solution proximity. I should give an answer to some of these, by the way. Excuse me. Aboriginal people haven't been heard, so we need a voice to listen. That could have been a way of creating proximity, much more narrowing down the problem we're trying to solve to something a voice could solve. So there are answers there. But yeah, sorry, lack of a values proposition, lack of problem solution proximity, lack of a single message that everybody knew from the start, including a lack of leadership, because there isn't a natural leader like we have in campaigns. So the other guys picked a couple of people, we sort of didn't do that enough. And then don't repeat your other guy's message and try and react. There's some pretty fundamentals that any of us sitting around any campaign, whenever we, and we'll do it by accident, whenever we step on any of those landmines, go, hang on, well, we missed our values. Oh, hang on, we're off our message. Hang on, we're falling into the trap of talking about their thing. Hang on, what's the solution and how does it fit? You know, these are things we should be returning to all the time. And somehow, in the immense difficulty that must have been herding all those cats, all the basic rules just somehow couldn't get applied.
A question I have about maybe strategy as well in terms of trying to, because it's not like we don't have these referendums that often, right? 99 was the last time. So where do you allocate your resources? I just thought it was interesting when I'd heard sort of early in the campaign from people within the Yes campaign that Victoria wasn't an area that they were going to focus their time and energy in. And to me, I thought that might be a bit of a red flag. And I think I'm assuming the assumption was, Victoria's a progressive state and therefore we don't need to campaign there. And, you know, I've heard that even after all of the election wins in the last, 2014, 18, 22, Labor was always going to win in Victoria anyway. It didn't matter because it's a progressive state. And I always thought, well, no, that's not the case actually. You need to go win those votes. And I think the results show that, you know, it takes a great campaign to win the support and the faith of Victorian voters. It's not just, I'm going to turn out because I'm progressive. You actually have to go campaign to those people. And that rule can be applied to any state. It's not just Victoria, right? You can't take voters for granted. And if you take them for granted, then you're going to get tripped up. And I just thought it was interesting that in the early stages of this campaign, there was decisions made that I think that they may look back on it and go, probably shouldn't have done that.
There's also a couple of other factors. I just want to, jump in if I haven't frozen. So Victoria didn't have resources. We're lucky we built a ground game of volunteers, but we galvanised a group of Aboriginal leaders to mobilise this through the lack of resources. But we also had the First Peoples Assembly, which would have been critical in this campaign. Yet, at the latest, the First People's Assembly, at the first term, the term that I led, the latest we could go to an election was October. We had to hold an election before then. Could you imagine if we went to the polls now? There would have been complete absence of, engagement from Aboriginal people in Victoria. So they couldn't campaign. We had to go to the polls in June in order to create some element of space so we could actually start campaigning, or they could start campaigning towards the voice. And by that time, it was too late. Yet we had numerous conversations around the date and the challenges we're up against. But it just speaks to the challenges we're facing in Victoria, whether they thought we were fine. But it goes to your point. Victoria is a progressive state, but it's a hard-earned, hard-fought and hard-won state. And you can't underestimate that.
John, you're going to jump in on as well.
Can I just make a point about strategy, Stephen? And this will sound more scathing than I intended, but it's hard to argue that there was a yes strategy. Now, there may or may not have been a document that had strategy written at the top of it, and sometimes we literally managed to run campaigns without that document. But also, if it missed so many of the key ideas, then it's hard to think that we would have had a strategic proposition to do what happened. But I actually make that claim of no strategy on much more simple evidence than that. A political strategy is not a secret. Your tactics may be, but your strategy is not. Your strategy is something that is abundantly obvious to someone who doesn't take much notice of politics by the time voting day comes around. Now, Abbott's strategy, same channeling the same mindset. Dutton's strategy, he laid out very clearly for all to see. I will progress from uncertainty into risk, to permanent uncertainty into division, and he pretty much laid that early on. You need to deliberately lay that out early on so that all your troops know what the game plan is. And he laid that out for people. No one laid it out for our side. And then, even if you haven't been watching that closely, in hindsight, anyone can see that strategy. Please, somebody tell me the strategy that Yes had. Somebody tell me the core values proposition we were anchoring in. Somebody tell me the core message that we had. Because I know that there was sort of 4 or 5 of them that were literally there, all of which I have tested, all of which tested well, that were never put under a single unifying banner. The purpose of a strategy is to determine the single unifying, or among other things, that. So I don't think it is too unreasonable to say that, in effect, there wasn't really a Yes strategy to speak of.
Can I offer something, though, in the defence of the Yes side, perhaps? And that is the point we made earlier, that it was a different task they had at hand compared to the No campaign. By the sheer nature of getting 4 states, you have to spread your resources more broadly than what the No campaign had to do. And when we were tracking, thanks to the Facebook ad library, tracking through the real-time ad spend, we could see that the Yes campaign was spending right across all the mainland states and Tassie in order to achieve the double majority. The No campaign didn't have to do that. And we could see this with the ad spend, they were spending most of their money on South Australia and to a lesser extent Tasmania. Look at the South Australian result. I can't help but think, I mean, that was a real surprise. It's got a Labor government. It's also got an assembly there. For it to do so badly, for the Yes side, I think is a hallmark of the strategy and the effective campaigning of the No camp that was very prioritised to South Australia. And to Marcus's point about Cambridge Analytica, which I think, if I got that right, Marcus, your point was how Trump got up in 2016, 49,000 votes or whatever across 3 states by doing this very targeted ad spend, targeting through social media to really reach the characteristics of the voters that they thought would flip over and be enough to win the election, even though they lost the popular vote by 3 million or whatever it was. I think that's a similar thing that we saw here with the Yes and the No. The No knew they just had to go for those 2 smaller states, Tassie and South Australia, and they did that.
Precision.
Let's talk about the misinformation, because I know our listeners will want to get some thoughts from you guys on this. And I must admit, my personal view is this stuff doesn't mean shit if you're running a good campaign. This is like, there's always misinformation and disinformation in political campaigns. There was plenty of that run around in 2022 for the state election campaign, but it didn't matter because your central message and your central campaign is going to kick ass and it'll deal with that. However, when that doesn't happen, then it becomes a bit of an issue. Andrea.
Yes.
Talk to me about this. I mean, I've got 2 questions for you. One, how much of an impact did it have in this campaign? I know, quantitatively, we don't know that just yet, but just your own gut feel. And 2, how much does the media, the mainstream media, bear responsibility for elevating some of this shit in the name of just trying to be, balanced in their reporting?
Wow. Yeah, lots of things there. First of all, I agree with you about the mis and disinformation that, yes, it's always been around since we've had the digital sphere, and it's a tool of political campaigning, political communication. Misinformation being that hapless spread of falsehoods, disinformation being the deliberate spread of falsehoods for political gain. How much of it? There was lots of it sloshing around. You didn't have to look very far. There was heaps of it on Twitter or X. One of the things that I saw that was new of this was the amount that was targeted at the AEC. Super worrying trend from my point of view as a political scientist, but should be a worrying trend for all of us that care about democracy, which should be all Australians. And seeing the American tropes come in there about rigged elections, stolen elections, and lots of just crazy stuff that can only work to erode public trust in the neutral electoral commission that up until this point has had high trust, so that's a concern. But the other point, Stephen, which I'm really concerned about, is the free pass mainstream media gives itself with the spread of mis and disinformation, that reporting on a mis and disinformation campaign does not let you off the hook. And often we saw this with the death tax, that 53% of mainstream media stories we tracked then, coming from News Corp, did not disabuse its audience, its public that it's meant to serve, that was not ALP policy. And we saw the same thing here, that reporting on mis and disinformation, you serve to amplify those false narratives. It gives it the legitimisation of mainstream media and professional journalism. And that's just the generous side of it. The more worrying side is where you've got so-called professional journalists working for outfits that take a very mischievous take on something, and then politicians run grabs of those news clips, post them up onto their socials, and they have large audience bases and they get shared and go viral, and you end up with this very long tail effect. Sometimes they will throw some false context around those clips, and we saw lots of examples of that. And some people might say, well, that's on the fringes. No, it wasn't, because it had that really long tail effect of being shared and retweeted and bounced around between the mainstream media and the social media platforms.
And I tell you what, I made calls on Thursday night, and I think out of my 80 odd calls I made, I spoke to one yes voter. I don't know what area I was calling into, but it wasn't friendly terrain. And out of the people that I did speak to who were voting no or already had voted no, they were repeating back to me all of these lines that were being run by the No campaign in terms of this mis and disinformation. It was just all this crazy UN bullshit and just all sorts of stuff. And I was just like, oh my God, like they've been on the same, they've been like a metronome. They're like Glenn McGrath just bowling down that corridor of uncertainty, just delivery after delivery after delivery. And eventually you're going to get a wicket. And that's what they've done in this campaign. I just like the vomit method. It always works. I just don't know why we want to not learn from these lessons, but it was anecdotally, it was I walked away from that phone bank going far out. Like they've hit the nail on their head here. Anyway.
Yeah, I really think whilst we should all share Andrea's horror at this and be participating as members of a civil society in trying to do what we can to try and structurally combat it, as campaigners on the ground, we've just got to bank it in. Like the other guys are going to be running lies and misinformation hard and sophisticated. And I sort of think, the only thing I can think to do about it is just be really clear with your values proposition, because if there's a fundamental concept of value that people believe in, then you're giving them the best armour against that misinformation. But, it's horrible. It shouldn't happen, and we should be very concerned about it.
Well, I've got a question for you, John. And that was...
Can I just jump in on that,
Yeah,
Steve?
go for it, Marcus, go for it.
I just want to say one thing. I mean, I've got really strong views on it, which I'll sort of reserve once my thoughts are a little clearer. But one of the challenges we faced as Aboriginal leaders in that debate, it was so deeply personal, the mis and disinformation, that it was paralysing, that it was really hard. But, like, how can you say that? And then you've got an Aboriginal person standing up for the other campaign, actually parroting it down, and you're just like, what's going on here? So it paralysed a lot of our leadership. It traumatised a lot of our leadership. And that's when we probably needed that allyship support and that strategy on how to cut through it, because it was deeply personal. It was hurtful. Like, these are messages that they were talking about our kids, and they knew it was triggering for us. And so they kept doing it because they knew it was putting us out of play. So you could say their strategy was good, but the damage that it's left, I mean, I don't know if it potentially could be irreparable.
John, to that point, and the point you were just making before, I've seen some commentary since Saturday saying that the Yes campaign failed to give information, and if they did that, particularly around cold, culturally, linguistically diverse voters, that they would have had a bit more success. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Look, that is an easy conclusion to draw. If you listen to people, they'll say to you, I don't know much about it, or I don't have enough information. They might say that in focus groups, or certainly say it in a survey if you offer it as an option or even as an open-ended answer. But I've got to say, and I am not joking here, hundreds of times I have taken messages for testing into focus groups with thousands upon thousands of Australians. And on hundreds of occasions, the message has been primarily rebutted on, yeah, I'm just not sure about that. I'd really need more information. I have hundreds of times taken more information back to them, or had it ready to go, or taken it to the next focus group. And hundreds of times that has failed. It never, ever works. When someone is saying to you, I don't have enough information, what they mean is, I don't know what your core proposition is about. Literally, it goes like this. I want more information, give them more information. Yeah, I still want a bit more, give them a bit more. Yeah, it's a bit confusing. Can you answer all these other questions? Answer all of them. It's really very confusing, all of this. I think I might just leave things the way they are. Couldn't you just sum this up a little bit better? So, you need a really clear values proposition. When I've literally gone back with this advice routinely, focus groups have said we need more information. Clients concerned to give more information. I say, hang on a minute. I look their advertiser and I say, less information, more values clarity, more emotionally compelling description of that values proposition. Less information, not more, is absolutely not on my list of things that went wrong, and it is it's not the right interpretation of the problem.
I want to wrap up, but before we do, I want to go to you, and we'll get some final reflections from everyone. But to you, Marcus, first of all, what does this mean for self-determination, and where do we go from here?
It means the Australian public have voted on 92 words that they didn't think was the best pathway forward. They didn't see constitutional enshrinement as the mechanism to improve the lives of our people. This was not a referendum on us as a people. It was a referendum on 92 words to constitutionally enshrine a voice. What we have now is an opportunity to roll our sleeves up and get to work. How do we fix the issues that are still present today and they'll still be present tomorrow? That's what this means now. This referendum wasn't a success. We accept the vote. That's where it is. The pathway forward is what we have to get around the table, and we're seeing states doing amazing and phenomenal work on self-determination. What we need to do is now drive that and see what that looks like at a federal level. But it starts with conversations, but the principle doesn't change. The principle that local communities know what's best for their people. They still need to be in the driver's seat of their own destinies. They should be advising government on issues that impact them. That does not change. So the pathway forward started yesterday, and we need to get cracking on how do we improve the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Fantastic. Final reflections from our other two wonderful guests, starting with you, Andrea.
Well, beautifully said, Marcus. Very hard to come off the back of that. I would say, yes, I think the heavy lifting will be with the states, as it often is when we're progressing policy in this country. The states did a lot of the heavy lifting with same-sex marriage equality well before we got to the plebiscite with same-sex union legislation. The states did the heavy lifting with COVID-19 measures as well, and I think that's going to be the case here as well in progressing our recognition of Indigenous rights. And the other thing I would just say is, the referendum, they're hard to pass, and it's even made more difficult when you have two Indigenous leaders that were leading the No campaign front and centre the whole way. That's a very powerful tool to be using.
John?
Yeah, actually, I'm really, I think there are some campaign lessons to learn and we can reflect upon them, but I'm really interested in the way forward in self-determination, and something that ended up coming up in the campaign that I think was harmful, that I think we could learn from. Self-determination is a principle that every person should be able to set their own course for the future. It's a beautiful idea. It's a universal one that ought to apply to everyone. There's a couple of exceptions. I don't let my 6-year-old set her own course about how much chocolate she's going to eat in one sitting. And in talking to my brother, we may or may not allow my 86-year-old dad to be the one who makes the decision about the point at which he needs to get some other support and care. So there's a category of circumstances when there's a category of circumstances when it isn't proper for someone to set their own course, right? And the thing that comes together there is an incapacity, right? An incapacity to make a good choice. So when we have been running around the place talking about endlessly about Aboriginal disadvantage, which is really true and we must talk about, but I just want to talk about, I was talking about it differently. When we talk about Aboriginal people like that and we double down on it, we create this impression of this sort of broken and incapable people. I've got to say, what I've seen in this campaign is the dead opposite. But tonally, you get this sense. And so then the notion that this broken people beaten down by 230 years, so you want to give them more power, doesn't tonally fit, right? And I would really like us to remove the terminology of Aboriginal disadvantage and flip that out for barriers that have been put in the way of First Nations people. And could I just explain that a little bit more philosophically? If I have a disadvantage, that may be my fault, no one's fault, or some other person's fault. Like, I could have had an accident, or I could have done it to myself, or whatever. I've got some sort of disadvantage, right? When an entire group, a demographic cohort, doesn't matter which one, is at a disadvantage, there must be some barrier in the way of that group of people. It couldn't possibly be, unless you believe in some fundamentally sort of bigoted idea, that that group of people is inherently lacking or disadvantaged. I don't think, and I certainly don't think we do much of it, we wouldn't usually refer to women as the most disadvantaged gender in the country. Well, they certainly are, perhaps trans people aside, but the point we would make is there's unfair barriers in the way. For decades, we're talking about a glass ceiling. What's a glass ceiling? It's an artificial barrier placed in the way by people. Now, two things about this. One is that we don't want to reinforce this disadvantage notion, but the beautiful thing about a barrier compared to a gap, I'd love closing the gap to be changed to removing the barriers. A barrier is artificial, it's put in place by a person can remove it, therefore the clear road is attainable. A gap is a hard thing, a disadvantage is a hard thing to deal with. Barriers are artificial, humans put them there, humans can take it away. I'd love if there's going to be another national debate about First Nations people, I hope it's not centred on disadvantage, and I hope it's centred on the unfair, artificial barriers and what we're going to do to get it out of the way.
I did say final thought, not final thesis, but now I actually want to ask, I want to ask Marcus what his thoughts are on that. Your final rant. Marcus, what are your thoughts on that?
I think John's spot on. I can't really add anything to that. I think that's the pathway forward. One of the hardest things we've seen in this debate is such the negative frame in which we've been spoken about, where we have always come from a strength-based position on how we talk about ourselves, and the successes and the resilience and the resistance of within our communities. So I think I can't add anything to how John summed it up. It's perfect.
Well, I'd like to end on a note of hope, and I think people certainly listening to this show will be looking for some hope. And I can tell you there is some hope in the state of Victoria, because in the state of Victoria we have a First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. We have a voice that is now elected an assembly for the second time. They've grown their voter roll. The self-determination is happening here in Victoria. There is truth telling. And they are steps away from actually beginning to negotiate a historic treaty with the Victorian State Government. So if you're looking for some hope in these dark clouds, it's happening here in the great state of Victoria. And I hope other states across the Federation pick up from the good work that people like Marcus and a whole bunch of others have done here in Victoria. To all three of you, Andrea, Marcus, and John, thank you so much for coming on the show today, but also for blending your voice, your experience over the course of the last as we've been talking about this referendum leading up to Saturday. Didn't get the result, but we'll keep plugging away and work towards supporting our Aboriginal brothers and sisters going forward. So thanks for your time today on today's show. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Morris Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.